evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this event in the American Inspiration Author Series presented by American Ancestors NEHGS in partnership with the Boston Public Library and the State Library of Massachusetts. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us tonight in the land of history, looking at early America. On your screen is a schedule for our hour-long event featuring author Tobey Pearl and her recently published work, Terror to the Wicked, America's first trial by jury that ended a war and helped form a nation. Many of you have attended our events before, our virtual events, but for you new folks, a few housekeeping items. We are in a Zoom webinar format, which means your microphone is muted and your video is off. While we cannot take your comments in the chat box, we will share some relevant links there. We do want to hear from you though, especially if you have questions for the author. You can place those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Many of you submitted questions as you registered. Thank you for those. If you think of others, please enter them into the Q&A and we'll cover as many as possible. Tonight's format will be a bit different from usual. Soon, our featured author will present her book for approximately 30 minutes using her own technology. Then the balance of the program will be devoted to Q&A. First, some questions from the presenting partners, then your questions for Tobey. So this will soon become your time, your night. The entire program is being recorded by my colleagues here at the Brew Family Learning Center at American Ancestors NEHGS, and the video will be published on our website in the days ahead. We'll share that link in the chat, and we'll also send you an email when it's ready. One thing that is usual here is the assigned copies of Terror to the Wicked can be purchased through our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts. You'll see on the screen right now the code AMINSP20, which is also being placed in the chat. Do write it down. If you use the code as you order online, they'll waive the shipping fee for media mail. Even better, as I said, the hardcover book you receive will have in it the author's signature on a book plate, your own signed copy. And now some official background on our author tonight. Tobey Pearl earned degrees in law and international relations from Boston University, and she studied international law at the University of Hong Kong. Terror to the Wicked is her first book. She lives with her husband, the author Matthew Pearl, her 3 children, and a rescue dog, usually up here in Massachusetts, but she's now down in Florida, which makes it even more special that she's with us. So welcome again. I'm Margaret Talcott, the producer of literary programs at American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society, and as I said, part of the Brew Family Learning Center. Tobey is quite familiar with my organization, NEHGS, and she'll tell you a bit more about that in a bit. But from all of us here, Tobey, welcome. We've been looking forward to this evening.
Thank you so very much, Margaret. And I'm eager to thank each of you, Margaret, Beth, Tricia, and Kristen, and the partner organizations who are supporting this talk tonight. I very much appreciate being here and the wonderful turnout we have for tonight. And I do just want to make sure to thank NEHGS and the Boston Public Library, as well as the Massachusetts State Library. And as Margaret alluded to, my book, which I really began working on about 5 years ago, began at NEHGS. The genesis of my project began there. And at the time, I did not know that it was going to become a book. This was, from what I can recall, about 2015. My husband and I had just welcomed our 3rd child. And like many people, I became curious about my family history, my genealogy. And if memory serves, I think it was as a holiday gift, my husband, Matthew, bought me a membership to NEHGS. And it's right in downtown Boston in Back Bay, and it's a flagship research resource for genealogical research, as well as they have a really fabulous collection of broad holdings. So I began doing my genealogy and piecing my family history together, and I'm sure there are people in the audience who maybe are tuning in tonight for similar reasons. Perhaps they have an interest in this early period due to family history, or we may have amateur historians or even academics. And I think tonight will be an interesting talk for everyone. But it didn't take long for me working at NEHGS and piecing together my genealogy to realize that I actually had a distant great-great-grandfather, very distant great-great-grandfather, who actually happened to be a judge and a governor of Plymouth Colony. And when I realized that Thomas Prince, Plymouth Colony Governor Thomas Prince, was my distant great-grandfather, I was kind of curious to see what the period of time that he had presided over, what eventful moments had transpired. And that's when I stumbled across this landmark jury trial. And at the time, Prince actually served as judge at this jury trial, and it is kind of the first significant landmark jury trial in our history. And as someone who once practiced law, and as someone who served on a jury myself, I was riveted. And I started to piece together why this jury trial was so significant to the leaders, both Indigenous and settlers, why this jury trial was so important, both the trial in particular, and why jury trials generally were such a fundamental building block of the early settlements. And that really began my journey and my adventure, kind of using not just NEHGS at that point, but really jumping into all of the wonderful research resources that we have in Boston and the South Shore and beyond. And I'll dive into that a little bit more as I begin to share my slideshow presentation with everyone. But I was able to do quite a bit of piecing together to really move out of genealogy and into the project that became my book, Terror to the Wicked, which tells the story of brutal murder, manhunt, and the remarkable jury trial that followed. And just to share a quick overview with everyone, the murder, which took place in 1638, was a really ferocious attack that happened in a very desolate area south and slightly to the west of Plymouth Colony. So this is kind of heading toward present-day Rhode Island, and took place in a desolate, dark, wooded area on a footpath, a foot trail, and there was a group of 4 indentured servants who had escaped Plymouth Colony. And at the time, indentured servants were mostly men, although some women as well, who came over to Plymouth Colony and Mass Bay Colony, present-day Boston, and the Virginia colonies. But the focus of my research was this Plymouth Colony area. Indentured servants usually served for about 7 years, a term that could be extended. And indentured servants were not allowed to leave Plymouth Colony without permission. But this group of indentured servants had escaped Plymouth Colony during the night, kind of slipping away from the households where they lived and worked for very little reimbursement under very grueling conditions. And they headed out on this footpath, hoping to escape and leave Plymouth Colony behind. And the ringleader of this group of indentured servants, a man named Arthur Peach, a man who kind of had a remarkable journey in his own right, leaving Ireland, perhaps fighting in Europe, and then heading to England, where he sailed from Gravesend, England, to the Virginia colonies, making his way up to Massachusetts Bay Colony, and then to Plymouth Colony. It was this Arthur Peach who was kind of the ringleader of these indentured servants, and he is the one who instigated this attack and eventual murder that took place in the woods. And the murder victim was an American Indian man who at the time was called Pequot. He was a member of the Nipmuc, and he was on a trading mission actually for the Narragansett. And Pequot had just completed his trade, trading beaver pelts for wampum at Plymouth Colony's kind of outpost trading location. And he was heading back on this trail when he passed what became known as the Peach Gang for a second time. And on this second encounter between Arthur Peach and Pequot, Arthur Peach kind of waved the trader over to a campfire with a ruse of offering tobacco and that it was a moment of friendship. And in this very moment, he attacked Pequot with a dagger that he was carrying. And Pequot incredibly was able to escape. Even though he was outnumbered, brutally injured in this remote, desolate area, he escaped into a swamp that was nearby. And incredibly, he survived long enough to identify his killers to none other than the founder of Providence, Rhode Island, Roger Williams. So I know I've thrown a lot of names and information. So I'm going to start to switch over to my slideshow, if you'll bear with me as it loads for a moment. And I'll give everyone who's out there tonight a little bit better view of the backdrop to these events, which was the Pequot War. Okay, so if all is well, you should be seeing the cover of the book, which as I was saying, this trial that took place in 1638, the murder, manhunt, and jury trial all unfolded against this backdrop of the Pequot War. A lot of people, I feel like, sometimes we think of the Pequot War as this hidden war. It's not often kind of a part of our spoken history about this period, but it was a gruesome war, and it was a moment of attempted genocide. And again, I use the word attempted because I just want to speak very carefully about that. But what you're seeing here on the cover is kind of one of the more gruesome moments of the Pequot War. And as it's labeled, this is the Mystic Massacre. And you can see what appears to be a fence kind of in the center of the cover. And at the time that was known as a palisade. It was an Indigenous defensive measure meant to act and serve as a fence, a defensive protection against an attack by settlers. And what we have here is a moment when Bay Colony soldiers not only attacked Pequot at Mystic, but attacked the settlement fort when many men were away, and they ultimately set fire to the settlement, killing women and children, elderly. So this is a very dark and important moment in our history. And I hope one of my goals with writing this book was to kind of highlight exactly what transpired during the Pequot War and how this jury trial fit into this dark chapter of our history that a lot of people haven't had the chance to learn very much about. And it's an important moment. It's an important chapter in our history. So I mentioned Arthur Peach, the man who attacked Pequot. Arthur Peach not only had this kind of remarkable journey coming to Bay Colony and then down to Plymouth Colony, but he actually also served as a soldier against the Pequot in the Pequot War before his indenture began in Plymouth Colony. So Arthur Peach ties very directly into the events of the Pequot War and kind of this brutal aftermath of the battles that were raging and the tensions that continued into that summer when the murder happened at the end of July, 1638. So I know we've discussed a lot of people who pop up in the book, this cast of characters. I've outlined them here just to kind of help keep some of the names straight. And there are many others who surface in my book, but these are certainly the most important historical figures to kind of keep in your mind as we continue forward with our discussion tonight. Pequot, as I mentioned, a Nipmuc trader who was trading on behalf of the Narragansett and the murder victim. Arthur Peach was his accused killer. And Arthur Peach was an indentured servant for none other than Edward Winslow, who was a one-time Plymouth Colony governor. Roger Williams, who attempted to come to the rescue of Pequot, was the founder of present-day Providence, Rhode Island. At the time of this murder, he was not yet a colonial governor without a charter at the time, but he certainly took a leadership role in trying to handle this, the murder that happened in the woods outside of Providence, in between Providence and Plymouth Colony. We haven't gotten to him yet, but we'll talk a little bit more about Roger Williams and also about Will, who is a young boy who was living in Roger Williams' home at the time. And Will, as it turns out, had a very pivotal role in these events. Massasoit Usamiquin was sachem of the Wampanoag. The Wampanoag, it was the Wampanoag land on which Plymouth Colony sat and on which Plymouth Colony's trading outpost sat as well. And there was a very complicated kind of lease arrangement and one of the first international treaties which dictated the use of land and the use of wampum as a currency of the day. And then, let's see. We also have William Bradford, who was a former Plymouth Colony governor, John Winthrop, governor of Mass Bay Colony, Stephen Hopkins, who may be a familiar name to some. He was a notorious tavern owner, a tavern that we think Arthur Peach visited in Plymouth Colony, much to the chagrin of Edward Winslow. And Dorothy Temple was one of these few female indentured servants that we see in Plymouth Colony at the time. And she and Arthur Peach formed a courtship, some type of relationship, and she became pregnant and later faced very serious consequences living in the settlement as an unwed mother. So we can talk a little bit about what that was like to live in a Puritan settlement as a woman during that period and to be in that situation. This map I find incredibly helpful. It was created very generously and kindly by Bill and Kristen Keegan, who are historical geographers, and they do a remarkable amount of work. What might look like a very simple map reflects hundreds, if not more, hours of their time that they donated to this project to recreate the landscape. And it's worth noting that things looked very different almost 400 years ago, the coastline and other landmarks. And if you can see, I'll try and move my cursor to this kind of oval shape. The dotted marks are the footpath that Arthur Peach traveled on and that Pequot was traveled on. That dark oval is the swamp that Pequot was hidden overnight after he was attacked, so he could survive long enough to identify his killers in a dying declaration to Roger Williams. And I was able to identify that there was an island in that swamp at the time through a book in the collection at NHGS. Today, if you go to that swamp, the island no longer exists. So that was kind of reflects one small window into some of the research challenges of recreating not what the landscape looks like today, but what it looked like almost 400 years ago. And it, of course, looked very different. And if you can see over here where it says Carswell, that's where Arthur Peach lived at the Winslow estate. And this footpath hugged the coastline and then headed here to the scene of the murder. A place that Roger Williams is described as fit for an evil purpose. And it certainly was. I'm going to, before I delve a little bit deeper into the research, which I'm really eager to share with you because that's kind of my favorite part of this whole project, I'm going to kind of freeze my presentation here for a moment. And what viewers are now seeing is an image of present day Plymouth Patuxent. Some of our audience members might know this as Plymouth Plantation before the name change. But this is a present day image that shows what those dwelling structures would have looked like back in 1638, these wattle and daub structures in Plymouth. And I'm going to read just a couple of quick paragraphs from my book to kind of set the stage, because I think anyone who's done, whether it's family research or historical research, knows that events don't happen in a vacuum and humans don't act in a vacuum, and that we're all kind of impacted by the trends and larger movements that are happening around us in our society, and migration and other major trends that are at play. And I'm going to read just a quick passage from my book that will show a nice picture, hopefully, of some of the trends that were unfolding in Plymouth Colony at the time that Arthur Peach decided to leave the settlement. So it begins. The trouble was that Massachusetts Bay Colony outpaced Plymouth in terms of both population and economic development, dwarfing the older and smaller settlements' former prominence. Massachusetts Bay spearheaded the ferocious battles of the ongoing Pequot War, a military campaign that some argued was little more than a land grab. As English settlers focused on increasing their geographic reach and enriching themselves, Massachusetts Bay moved to the forefront of these expansion efforts. Massachusetts Bay, which formerly had boosted Plymouth through trade, outstripped Plymouth's fast eroding place in the pecking order. The year of the Peach Gang attack, 1638, John Harvard endowed the now eponymous Center of Learning, the fledgling college that had been without a name since its 1636 inception. Plymouth was overlooked for this honor of housing New England's first major academic institution. Colonial leaders instead established the new school in the northern settlement of Cambridge, where upon the Lord's blessing, they began to erect a college. Also in 1638, an Englishwoman brought over America's first printing press, setting up the clunky contraption in Cambridge rather than in Plymouth. Even when an affluent merchant class infiltrated Plymouth, they settled on the colony's outskirts in Scituate. Rumblings began that the seat of government should be moved as well, away from Plymouth Colony proper. That Peach's gruesome attack on Penawiniac occurred in this landmark year for the colony and its neighbors, when many developing socioeconomic and political movements came to a head, is no coincidence. The decline in the colony's prestige, the chaos of war, and the influx of servants, coupled with their diminishing compensation, may have in part pushed Peach to flee in the first place. The year 1638 proved a watershed moment for the colony. The Plymouth's renewal hinged on prosecuting the Peach Gang, as did any hope that the war might come to an end. So that kind of sets the stage for the stakes involved as the murder happened, and the idea, the desperate focus of trying to stage one of the first significant jury trials in the country came to a head. And I'll go through a couple more slides as I get a little bit more into the jury trial and also into the research, which was really my favorite part of the whole project. Here we see a portrait of the Mayflower Compact. If you see the chest that they're signing the Mayflower Compact on, the man standing behind the chest is Edward Winslow, Arthur Peach's master, and the man seated fittingly with his armor headpiece is Myles Standish, who handled defense for Plymouth Colony. And they're signing the Mayflower Compact, calling for a civil body politic, kind of setting a very early stage for what was to come in some ways. And here, I had mentioned earlier a young boy who was named Will, and I'll just talk a little bit, very briefly. I know time is already flying by, and I know we're eager to field questions, but I'll talk quickly about research and how Will became kind of center stage in my research. When I decided to write about the trial and the manhunt and the murder, I wanted to share every bit of every detail of the events that transpired, and I wanted to be able to shine a light on each person who was involved. And I dug deep in the archives, and we're very blessed in the Boston area to have remarkable archival opportunities for research. But I also was able to benefit from the world-class Mashantucket Pequot Research Center, and I was able to do field research, go on an archaeological dig site, and really dive into what 1638 might have looked like at the time of the Pequot War, and use resources at Nipmuc Museum in Rhode Island as well, and just try and paint as detailed a picture as I could. I wanted, the book is a work of narrative nonfiction, and I wanted it to read like a page turner, to make it kind of an enjoyable look into history that felt comfortable to read for any reader who might be interested in picking up the book. But I also wanted to use the structure of narrative nonfiction to make sure I was capturing every relevant detail and every person in this research. And when I began really moving into the archival research and into the primary sources, many of which thankfully are transcribed, so they're available online for researchers, which is wonderful. But one thing that I did notice early on was that in one of the primary sources that I kept coming back to over and over and over again, I realized that while the Peach Gang murder had been written about in academic sources earlier, never in a book form like this, but there was one person who I quickly realized was always missing. And it took a lot of time, probably over a year, to kind of fully realize that there was a person missing in these events, and he was missing from the earlier accounts of what transpired. And there's a reference to Roger Williams sending a messenger out into the woods on a manhunt to track down the Peach Gang, who were already well on their way, on a run for freedom, this mad dash to escape justice in Plymouth Colony and in Providence, Rhode Island. And Roger Williams sent none other than the young boy who was living in his household at the time, who was a young boy named Will. And this was a Pequot boy. As we've talked about, these events unfolded against the backdrop of the Pequot War. Many Pequot were taken prisoner of war. Adult men were often sent to Bermuda, and children often ended up in slavery. And I kind of parsed through very carefully, relying on a lot of very helpful academic research to look at what exactly happened with the Pequot, that definition between prisoner of war and slave. And Will at the time was, I estimate, about 10 or 11 years old. Roger Williams did not leave a last will and testament, which might have kind of shown in more detail his thinking about Will, whether he was indeed treated as a slave. We know that John Winthrop's will, he gifted to his heirs his land and his Indians. So it was a lot of detective work to piece together who was Will, who was he in relationship to these events, and what happened to him, which is still unfortunately a bit of a mystery. But we do know that Roger Williams asked Governor Winthrop to name Will for him. And we know at the time that names were often attributes, and that it's likely that his name was Will in the sense of kind of the strength and fortitude he would need to survive these terrible circumstances he found himself living in as a young child. But it was Will who appears for the first time in my book as he relates to the Plymouth Colony, the Peach Gang murder, who tracked the escaped indentured servants through the woods and tracked them down and helped capture them, ensuring that they saw justice at the criminal jury trial. And I know we're running short on time. There's still so much I want to share with you all about the jury trial and some of my research methods before we move on. Maybe I'll just kind of make sure I've gone through all of my slides, and I guess we can always kind of delve into the research a little bit more during the Q&A part of our evening. This is John Winthrop. This is one of the few portraits we have of one of the colonial governors from the era. And this is an Indigenous marker tree. Dennis Downs is the photographer who was generous enough to share this image, so I was able to include it in my book. When I mentioned that Will captured and helped bring those 4 indentured servants to justice, that's accurate that they were all captured. One actually escaped and got away all the way, making all the way north to present day Portsmouth, New Hampshire area, that kind of Strawberry Bank area. And this one indentured servant with the last name Cross probably saw, perhaps utilized Indigenous marker trees to find and guide himself on the trails heading northward. And I wanted to include an image of what these Indigenous marker trees looked like. And this is one, and it's a really remarkable image. And Indigenous people would shape the tree and use it as a marker to help direct them on their path, and probably for other meaning as well. And I have a chapter in my book on the children's god and Penawinianquist. I wanted to give kind of equal time to each of the historical figures that I was writing about. And the murder victim, Penawinianquist, while we don't know a lot about him, these events happened almost 400 years ago. One of the things we do know is quite a remarkable bit of information that Roger Williams actually recorded, that when Penawinianquist was a child, he had a vision of the children's god. And I was able to do, actually using the libraries at Harvard, some anthropological research into what the children's gods were, how they were described by Indigenous people in that time period. And one thing that popped out at me in studying the Nipmuc, and there's a wonderful book for those who are interested called Manitou. And Manitou is a spiritual stone that has meaning for Indigenous peoples. And this is an image of a Manitou stone in Massachusetts. But for people who are interested in learning more about this topic, the book Manitou is extremely helpful. So this is an image I actually took. And again, just kind of on the topic of Nipmuc research resources, these are wonderful resources that are available today. Larry Spotted Crow Man is a famed Nipmuc writer and educator, and I hope to see his books far and wide, because I think they're some of the most important books coming out of Massachusetts today. And Drumming and Dreaming, a book that he wrote, really kind of transformed the way I was able to kind of look at the landscape in a whole new light. And his book, Whispering Basket, is also remarkable. And I think anyone who's at all interested in this topic would really benefit by picking up either. And his website is there, whisperingbasket.com. Nipmuc Nation became kind of not just a place I would go in the hopes of furthering my research, but an annual tradition for my family where we attend the last weekend in July of each year, the powwow there that's open to the public, which is a really wonderful way to see what's going on today with the Nipmuc and connect. And Larry Spotted Crow Man also has started a cultural resource center, Okitu. So that's the website for that, for anyone who might be interested in checking that out. And then this is the last image of my slideshow. And I know we're running a little short on time, but it is also the image that is most important to me. And this is one that's included in my book. This is the 1623 order mandating the use of jury trials in Plymouth Colony. Governor William Bradford wrote this order in the winter, December of 1623. You can see the kind of this first full paragraph, the last line, a jury upon their oaths. And this was one of the first things I really was struck by as I started my research, when I kind of started to consider, why were jury trials so fundamentally important to someone who is living in a hand-to-mouth existence, facing a grueling winter, a brutal starvation, the subsistence living? Why would someone in the dead of winter sit down and when other freedoms really hadn't been established. You know, I think about the rights that we sometimes really discuss kind of at the top of our list of important freedoms in America. If we talk about voting or free speech or the right to bear arms, we look back to this early period, and those weren't really rights. You know, it was a privilege to have a weapon. It was there was no free speech. It was very restricted, and even in kind of um, in ways that were hard to comprehend because of the puritanical society that it was. But nonetheless, it was jury trials that were of the utmost importance to the settlers at the time. And the more I learned, the more I realized, and it's all here in the book, and I'd be happy to talk about it more in the Q&A, but it was jury trials above any other right that became the freedom and the protection of liberty of last resort. And all that someone who was absolutely facing tyranny could hope for was that 12 of their fellow um, neighbors would stand up and step up and say, not on my watch, if they were facing false or trumped up charges. And this document is kind of, it's foundational to our jurisprudence today, and it ties directly into the remarkable and unlikely events that transpired in 1638. So I will wrap up my presentation at this point, because I know we have lots of questions, and I would love to dig more into the research especially. So any questions at all that relate to research, hopefully I can kind of offer some real tips to anyone who might be curious about research.
What amazing detective work you've done. What a real pleasure to see sort of your process behind what you've written. And I really appreciate the perspective that you bring. I think we all do. There is a lot to unpack here, going back nearly 400 years. And lucky me, I get to ask the first question tonight. So Tobey, one of my favorite aspects of your book is that in many ways it addresses both the past and the present. Your work really inspires interest in Indigenous cultures, particularly the present-day Nipmuc Indians, which are they're near Grafton, Massachusetts. You and I talked about. Your slide was so helpful. In the epilogue, too, you cast us forward on many fronts. Most present for you, of course, is the personal connection to the judge, Thomas Prince. But in the book's closing, you also introduce us and bring us all the way forward into the lives of other families connected to the trial, the Mavericks, the Lothrops. Can you talk a bit about your epilogue and why you undertook that varied research and those many histories also of architecture and also of landforms? You really bring us up to the present in a lot of different places, and I admired it. Tell us about what drove you to write those many histories.
Well, thank you so much. That's one of my favorite questions I've ever had, because the epilogue was a little bit of an add-on, but it's kind of a piece of the book I care very much about. Certainly, and perhaps it is because this project started out of research on my family history, but I kind of had this curiosity about what happened to everyone, to these characters, these historical figures that I had spent so many years studying. What happened to the Nipmuc? What happened to everyone that I had kind of really delved into and looked so carefully at? And I really, a big piece of what I had hoped to find was what happened to Will. And unfortunately, that remains a mystery. I wish there was more documentation on that. But I think one of the most important endpoints to really keep in mind as we're looking at this book and the ramifications is that the Nipmuc, while they have attempted to gain federal recognition and they do have state recognition, they do not at this moment in time have federal recognition. And that is something that I think is an important conversation about why today the Nipmuc are living without federal recognition. And I hope it's something that changes, and perhaps the story will kind of shed light on the the fraught period of 1638 and how there is just this line that can be drawn from then till present day. And I can see it in my own family and in the struggles of Indigenous people. And I can see some very, very striking disparities that are frustrating. And I think living in a state like Massachusetts, there's so much we can do to be aware and have that discussion in our own families. And we have a lot of history in Massachusetts, and we all learn kind of this origin narrative of our country when we're growing up in school in Massachusetts and nationwide. And it's such a deeply flawed origin narrative. And I hope, you know, I'm so proud to be here with librarians and wonderful research resources. And that's where we can get this a better look at this history and where we are today and how it's all connected.
Thank you so much. That's a great answer. Thank you. Kristen, did you want to ask a question?
I did. I was just unmuting. Tobey, so you just referenced libraries, and you did talk a little bit about how you started your research at NEHGS, and you've used a lot of archival resources and other resources. Is there a particular library or library experience that you would like to share in your research experience writing the book?
That's a wonderful question. You know, I two kind of anecdotes jump to mind. One is just the relentless generosity and goodwill of the librarians at the Cambridge Public Library main branch location, who were fabulous. And I think it might surprise many to realize what you can do with your local public library card. And they were able to track down books from, I want to say, across the country, books from institutions that weren't in the habit of loaning books, who were able to loan them. So I could access a book that was important to me, and there it would be. I was able to order it, even on special loan, access the book I needed, and return it to the library. And that relationship went on for years. There's, you know, the books are stacked and ready to go once you request them. So if there is something that's kind of off the beaten path and you're thinking about researching it and you feel like you don't have all the resources at your fingertips to do it, please check in with your local librarian, because they are the absolute best resource available. So I could not have done it without those librarians. The flip side of this, and I say this with absolute love for Harvard, because they have wonderful collections and which are meant and dedicated for the students at Harvard. I was very lucky to kind of, I hope it's okay, I'm admitting this, but kind of my husband helped sneak me into the library, and I was able to access one thing that public libraries don't often have are access to very highly specialized, expensive database. In this case, I wanted to see the King's Calendar rolls, and there was a particular database that had access to it. And Margaret, please correct me if I'm wrong. This may have been a resource, a database that NEHGS does have access to. And I should say, I think there was some kind of, my husband is an alum, and there was a day pass that was in order, but I had very quick hours to kind of go through the calendar rolls of looking specifically for the period of King Charles I to see if there was any tie-in for the period in which I was writing, and there was, so it was invaluable.
Great. Thank you so much, Tobey.
Okay, I think I get the next question, and my first one is very short. We have a load of questions for you, but this one will be short, and that is, where does the title of the book come from?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Thank you, Beth. So, Terror to the Wicked, I mentioned that my many times back great-grandfather was the judge and the governor of Plymouth Colony at the time of the trial. Terror to the Wicked was something of a nickname for him. So I've had people ask me, are you very proud to be related to Thomas Prince? And I'm very proud. You know, when we look back at our ancestors surviving difficult periods of time, but I think there's a lot to overcome in his legacy and this difficult chapter in our history. So it's a little bit of both, but it was an appropriate nickname for him. And it also kind of shows the stark understanding of good and bad and evil and all the rest of it of the time.
Great, thank you. Margaret?
The questions that I have here, and many of them are coming in over the chat as well, are about other trials and the legal process. Let's actually focus on the legal process. One question is, I'm interested to learn how our legal system developed. I know that in small towns, the church did a lot of the job of control. And then another question, what about the Salem witch trials? How do they relate? And putting on your legal hat, if you could just, tell us a little bit about, another person on the chat asked, why were trials so important in Plymouth Colony? So I think that's one topic there.
Those are all great questions. I'll try and answer them in order. So laws at the time, I'll just quickly note because there's a lot to kind of unpack there, but by way of offering little pieces to people who may be interested in taking this research further on their own, it's worth noting that Roger Williams at the time, when he discovered the murder victim, did not want to host a jury trial himself. He felt tremendous pressure, his writing at the time reflects. His mentor, the person he kind of interned for, if you will, was Edward Coke in England, kind of the founding father, some would describe him as, of jurisprudence, common law traditions. So you can see in Roger Williams coming over and setting up the settlement in Providence, Rhode Island, the pressure was on Roger Williams's shoulders. He knew exactly kind of the expectation for a serious criminal trial and a jury trial. So they weren't just coming up with some of these ideas out of thin air. And it was a real challenge to hold a jury trial. Keep in mind, Plymouth Colony at the time, the population was about 550 people. Women could not serve as jurors. 17% of the population were indentured servants. They were disqualified. Settlement leaders, conflict of interest, and so on. So there are very few people who could serve as jurors, and you see Roger Williams grappling with that. And I think that first question may have alluded a little bit to a body of law called customals, which were these hyper-regional areas of law back in England that dictated how certain legal questions that would pop up would be interpreted. And you can see in some of the land deeds, if there's a dispute on this land deed, we're going to use the customal of this little hamlet in England. That's going to dictate how this will be resolved. So there were bodies of different law, and they were resolved in different ways. And there were endless disputes, and they involved property deeds, last will and testament, kind of probate issues, and criminal issues as well. As far as the Salem witch trials, that's the later half of the 17th century. So they don't quite tie into this early period of that I was working on. And then I think the last question was how my training aided me in looking at this. And I would say it's probably very boring, but I once worked in a job where I had to write lots and lots and lots of memos in an office all day. And writing memos really helped me to write a book because I had to be clear and concise and not use passive voice and get those details and facts and write them up in a way that illuminated all of the issues at hand. And that's exactly what I've tried to do, although I promise the book is much more fun than reading a memo.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you.
Tobey, we've had a lot of questions specifically about the juries and how the juries at the time were selected, who served on them, and this jury in particular, if you know who actually sat on it.
So that may well be my favorite question because it was the jury that completely transformed these events for me, because what unfolded was beyond anything I could have believed possible. The jury was made up of the settlers of Plymouth Colony. As I mentioned, these were not the indentured servants. These were not the leaders of the settlement of Plymouth. These were men, as the period dictated, who worked day in and day out largely as farmers. And they are all named in the what's known as the PCR, the Plymouth Colony record, and you can go and see their names, and I profile them very carefully in the book. And what I found so remarkable about the incredible outcome of the jury trial, given the backdrop of the Pequot War, I wanted to get into the thought process of those jurors. And I thought to myself, how can I do this? They were not the leaders of the colony. What can I find that will shed light on their thinking? And it was in their probate records. I was able to find the one item that's really well documented in many probate records at the time, their books. These were their libraries, what they were reading. And people, if I were working on a farm 12 hours a day, I probably would not be reading at night, but these men were. And the books they were reading were remarkable. And there was a man, a religious leader named Lothrop, many people will know his name, who was a very gentle, progressive kind of a person. And he was reading books in 7 different languages and studying humanism. And it turned out in the jury that a remarkable number of his followers ended up serving on that jury. And so my book really delves into why the Lothrop jurors had such a fundamental impact. And last quick thing I'll say, because I know we're out of time, is that one of his books can be found today in a Cape Cod library, and the details are in my book, and it's really a treasure to go see.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've had several questions about indentured servants. So and you did talk about this some already, but could you tell us more about the nature of indentured servitude in the early 17th century in Plymouth Colony, and if you know any more specifically about why Arthur Peach and his cohorts were fleeing the colony? And then we had one very specific question, and that is, what percentage of indentured servants became unlawful? Do you have any idea about that?
Well, I'll take the last question first. And there are some wonderful books out there about kind of the unlawful moments of the Puritans. And that includes settlers and indentured servants. And there are many, because of course, as we can now imagine full well, puritanical society is kind of ripe for transgressions. And the Puritans loved nothing more than catching these itty bitty transgressions and shining a light on them and delving into them. So there are some wonderful resources, and they're probably in my end notes. I wish I could think of a really helpful book off the top of my mind, but if it comes to me, I'll share it. But there's a lot of great work out there about exactly that. Life for indentured servants was brutish and difficult, and they were shortchanged. So we can see indenture contracts. So that's another kind of body of law for this period. These indenture contracts were formal written contracts. They were signed by both parties, and they usually stipulated a term of 7 years. And often in the early period of Plymouth Colony, they promised a tremendous amount of land at the end of the indenture term. As the years progressed, the land vanished, or it became 1 acre, or it became 1 acre dependent on good behavior, which over 7 years, and you have to remember Arthur Peach and Dorothy Temple, these are young people. Indentured servants were not allowed to date. They were not allowed to marry. They were not allowed to have children. So if you imagine your 7 years over your early 20s having those restrictions in place, and you can see those challenges. And then when the land kind of was pulled out away from them, that was yet another challenge. But I also do document a case that's representative of, I think, many of torture and abuse that happened to indentured servants. There was one boy who was whipped. I don't even want to go further into the details, but there were some really dire outcomes for indentured servants. So the more you dig into that research, it becomes much less surprising that people were willing to risk their lives and flee.
Great, thank you.
We have remarkably come right quickly to the end of our hour, and we have a few last things, and we want to hear from you one more time. It's some really great questions, and I'm sorry we can't get to all of them, and some great answers, Tobey. But as I said, being respectful, I'd love to turn to another reading from the book. Tobey, you know I truly appreciated your first reading and how it set the stage. And to one person's question, is this a legal book? No, it's not a legal book. It's a portrait of a time. It's a portrait of the Nipmucs. It's got a lot going on, but I think in this last reading, you might get a sense of really where this book's heart lies in a lot of places. Please, something inspirational, Tobey, to close us out.
Well, thank you, Margaret, because I do hope the heart of this book is the telling of our democracy and why a jury trial may be kind of the hidden cornerstone of our democracy. And I hope this following reading highlights and illuminates that to some degree. So it begins, when juries made law in the colonies, they wrested control from centralized authorities and empowered local communities, a foundational principle for the fledgling nation. Average individuals, otherwise disenfranchised, became surrogate lawmakers. They became world changers. The jury in Plymouth Colony achieved justice for a stranger, indeed for a tribesman whose only surviving name meant essentially stranger. If democratic notions functioned for the judiciary, a government for and of the people also became possible. With the eyes of the world upon them, the jurors in the Peach trial became a harbinger of a period in the late 17th century that would become known as the heroic age of the English jury. In a landmark case from that period in England, jurors refused to convict religious leaders on trumped-up charges, avoiding outright tyranny. Those jurors became known as saviors of the sacred bulwark of the nation. Though largely overlooked today, the Plymouth jurors' remarkable stand for justice in 1638, in the face of raging bias and fraught loyalties, played a part in enabling later juries to rise against all odds as a democratic cornerstone.
I feel hopeful just hearing that. So thank you for that. And we're going to move on to some true closing words. Tobey, that was really a pleasure. And more about the book and more about you. Kristen, over to you.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you so much, Tobey. A reminder to you who are joining us here in the audience, if you'd like to buy a signed copy of Terror to the Wicked with free nationwide shipping, visit our partners at Porter Square Books and use code AMINSP20. Please mention in the comment field that you would like a signed copy with a book plate. Thank you to Tobey again and our collaborators. Thank you on behalf of the Boston Public Library. You can find out more about our resources and services at bpl.org. And now for some upcoming events. At the end of April, we have Deborah Lee, and then we have on May 13th, Dr. Celine Gounder. And on Wednesday, June 9th, we have Paula Peters. Thank you for joining us from the BPL. Beth, over to you.
Well, thank you all. As always, I have learned a lot about this topic from a brand new perspective. So I hope you'll all feel welcome to visit us at the State Library of Massachusetts, which is right in the State House once we reopen. In the meantime, we invite all of our viewers to have a look at our website to learn more about our great collections, our great services, and our great resources. The URL that's on the page right now will take you right to our homepage. You'll see that we, in this very brief introduction, that our holdings cover a wide variety of formats and topics, although almost all of them deal with the history of government in Massachusetts and Massachusetts history itself. So you're welcome to contact us for help with any of your research questions. We'll do our best to answer them while we're working from home. And then of course, we'll be glad to provide you even better service once we reopen. So we also have some great upcoming events. They cover very different aspects of Massachusetts history than what we heard about tonight. On Tuesday, May 25th, in collaboration with the Boston Public Library, Museum of African American History and American Ancestors, we will present Skip Finley and his new book, Whaling Captains of Color, America's First Meritocracy. And then on Thursday, June 3rd, in collaboration with American Ancestors, we'll talk about Joseph Bagley and his new book, Boston's Oldest Buildings and Where to Find Them. So I have them both already and I'm in the process of reading them both. So I hope you'll all be able to join us for these two events. Thank you, Margaret.
Beth, thank you so much. We are so delighted to have presented tonight's event with both your organizations. Thank you. We've heard from many in the audience that you've traced your relatives to colonial America, to the very days of this book, and to several of the characters, Tobey, that you've mentioned. It's been wonderful reading the chat. We'll make sure to share that with you. For all of you doing family research, please know that our virtual doors are wide open. You can visit our digital archives of diaries, journals, and family books, connect with databases worldwide. In addition to colonial research, we have a number of sources and publications helpful to the study of Indigenous cultures. In our follow-up email with tonight's video link, which Tricia will send to all of you, we'll put some links in from all three of our organizations, some resources we think might be helpful. For further intel, you can always connect with one of our genealogists at NEHGS at americanancestors.org, where you'll also find educational resources from the Brew Family Learning Center, including upcoming events such as this free event, past videos, and upcoming author talks. Even in this pandemic time, our mission is to educate, inspire, and connect. And driven by our love of history and American stories, we'll be presenting more virtual author talks, even this month, several. On April 27, in a special partnership with our Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center, we're presenting the acclaimed biographer Blake Bailey, known for his works on John Cheever, Richard Yates, and now Philip Roth. The book has been featured or reviewed nearly everywhere recently. Don't miss the author's conversation with moderator Michael Hoberman, a professor of American literature at Fitchburg State University. And he himself has written about Philip Roth, so they're going to have a great dialogue. And on April 29, we're joined by partners at the Boston Public Library, Huntington Theater, Porter Square Books, and GBH Forum Network. We're presenting the Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright, Kiera Alegria Udes, in dialogue with the broadcast journalist Maria Hinojoso. They'll be discussing her new memoir, My Broken Language. They'll also be joined by a surprise guest, so don't miss that. On May 6th, we're welcoming the geographer, the writer, the NYU professor, Joshua Jelly Shapiro, with his new book, Names of New York, Discovering the City's Past, Present, and Future Through Its Place Names. If you like colonial New England history, you might like this too. I know some of the criminals tonight in Tobey's book were on their way to New Amsterdam. They were heading in that direction and wanted out of Plymouth Colony, as you know, or they were heading to New Amsterdam, or was it Amsterdam Avenue on the New York's Upper West Side? There's a lot to look at in New York and its origins. The author is said to be a fantastic presenter. And I must tell you about one event that you don't see here, but I hope you'll mark your calendar. On Wednesday, May 12th, a number of us are hosting author Daniel James Brown, best known for his book, The Boys in the Boat. He's coming with his latest work, Facing the Mountain, a true story of Japanese American heroes in World War II. Don't miss this special evening presented in partnership with the Boston Public Library, the Japan Society of Boston, and the GBH Forum Network. Okay, back to tonight, to this riveting story of a trial and its people. Tobey, thank you for your presentation. Kristen, Beth, it was a pleasure. Thank you all for this education and for your insight. And to our audience, great questions. We wish all of you at home a safe evening and an inspirational springtime. Thank you from all of us in Boston and from Tobey in Florida. Have a good night.